Well, here we are with another lockdown of sorts. Instead of standing in church, I'm here alone in my office at SSU. It's Saturday, so I haven't shaved. I never shave on Saturdays so that I remember that it is Saturday. And I'm wearing my cozy, super warm sweater that Carol knit me 34 years ago because it's freaking cold out. And ironically, what I planned to talk about today or for tomorrow was why we gather. And I still am going to talk about that even though I'm here all alone. Here are my questions. What's the point of having a local church community? What's it mainly all about? This has been a question that's been on my mind for most of my adult life. Back in the 80s, when I was teaching a handful of students at Rockmere Christian Study Center, which is what Vic and Kathy, Carol and I called our first experiment of living together out in Moores Mills. Back then, I cared so much about this question that I read through the whole New Testament in a weekend with that specific question in mind. This is what I concluded after that reading project. The point is building each other up and building a community up. That was the point of meeting together from all the references that I could find in the New Testament. Now there's a word that named this for me in the New Testament, edification. We don't use that word too much these days, but occasionally you might hear the word edifice used for a building. So my study of the New Testament, when I looked at what the Gospels and letters of the early church had to say about why they got together, suggested that the point of getting together was encouraging each other to see life a certain way and to support each other in acting with integrity with that way of seeing. Today, about 35 years later, I still think that's the point. I probably wouldn't use the word edification to describe it lately, but I would say it this way. We need a social place that welcomes everyone who is interested to participate in exploring meaning together, to express it, to express meaning, to weave it into our lives, to act on it together, to connect it to where we've been and where we're going. And of course, if it's a Christian community that we're talking about, to integrate deliberate connections with the example and teaching of Jesus. And today, I appreciate different ways of weaving that meaning into our lives than I did 35 years ago. For example, back then, I would never have guessed that developing and falling in love with liturgy would become an important part of that for me, as it has with the Celtic service. Back then, it would also have felt more natural to use the term worship for part of this. And maybe that word is still important for you, or maybe it feels old-fashioned and out of date, but even back 30 some years ago, I would get frustrated when people equated worship with a kind of singing or prayer. Worship is so much more than that. It's the active part of our engagement with meaning. Worship is the translating of our talk and our abstractions into our being and our doing. It is our consent, our submission to the source of meaning, to the enabler of our love. It's all the acts of service to each other and acts of service to that source that make it real. But let's get back to how I'm describing this today, creating a social place that welcomes everyone who is interested to participate in exploring meaning together, to express it, to weave it into our lives, to act on it together, to connect it to where we've been and where we're going. And I want to say a word on why it needs to be a social place. We can, after all, do all these things on our own. We can explore meaning and weave it into our lives as individuals. But when we do this as individuals, rather than in conversation and shared action, the meaning stays thin and fragile. In some ways, that meaning will never quite feel as solid and reliable if our meaning differs too much from everyone else's. Because of this, our attempts to do this on our own often collapse into an acceptance of the most problematic and flavorless meanings of mass society around us. Meanings like competition and personal branding and the accumulating of individual financial security while we exploit the earth and each other. So a local church community provides a social space in which we can resist that collapse together, supporting each other in our actions and our beliefs that there is something more than the values and the anxieties of mass society. But there's also a danger on the other side. Communities can get too defensive, so aimed at resisting and fearing society that their meaning making gets hard and brittle and closed, and then it's no longer life-giving for anyone in or out of the community. I need to add that the main reason that this exploration needs to happen together is because I believe that love or connection or compassion is the beating heart of meaning. We need to intentionally explore our meanings with those we are connecting with and loving. We need to make sure that this love and connection reaches beyond our families and friends, that it extends to our communities and across our borders. And most of us need intentionality and structure to keep that reaching out happening. I think there are lots and lots of different ways in which church communities can engage in this kind of exploration and enactment of meaning together. It can look like our early Celtic service. It can look like our second or main service. It can look like the second breakfast services that we experimented with before the pandemic. And I'm sure it could look completely different altogether. Some of you have seen some recent posts that we've recently invited an imagination team to look at what we might look like in the future together. And this is going to be happening throughout this year, that a group is going to get together and dream together and experiment together and grapple with what that possibility could look like. So I hope that even this talk is an encouragement to them in their explorations. But here are some main things that I believe need to be included in this process. I think that a church getting together, a church community getting together to explore meaning needs to keep these things in mind. I believe it needs to be open to everyone who is interested in what the community is about. I don't think it has to change what it is about, but it needs to be more than a clique or a friendship club, or when you have to pass some kind of test to be included. Its doors should be wide open. It needs to deal with the real stuff of life, the good and the bad, the lofty and the mundane, with finding strength to go on and with recovering from our mistakes. It needs to draw nourishment from roots in the past and be freely open to what can be in the future. It needs to be about doing together and about actions, and not just about words and ideas and beliefs. It needs to be sustained by commitments to each other, by persisting in communication, by grace, and by forgiveness when we hurt each other and disappoint each other. And probably it needs coffee and probably music and engagement with the natural world and so much more. Okay, that's it. I wanted to keep this talk short. Those are some of my thoughts on what the point of all this church stuff is about. I hope that some of it resonates with you, and I hope that you share some of your ideas. So please add your thoughts on what this life together thing can be about. Add a comment to our Facebook page, or send me an email, or ask to go for a walk. I've missed seeing so many of you in normal life these last couple of years, and now I'll especially miss nearly all of you for the next couple of weeks. So hold on, everyone. Thanks.